I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on Jesus.
Stayed on Jesus.
Oh, I woke up this morning
with my mind
stayed on the Lord.
stayed on the Lord.
Well, I woke up this morning
with my mind
stayed on Jesus.
stayed on Jesus.
Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Listen, while I'm singing and praying with my mind stayed.
on Jesus.
Well, I'm singing
And praying with my mind
with my mind.
stayed on the Lord.
You know I'm singing and praying.
Praying with my mind
Stayed on Jesus. Hallelujah. Here's a question I want to ask. Why is it so hard for spiritual leaders to be honest about their sexuality?
There's a social contract that the black church has around sexuality, especially same-gender sex, which is as long as you stay in the closet and as long as you preach heterosexist sermons, and as long as you beat up on same-gender loving people, then we will look the other way. And so we'll ordain you as long as you're willing to keep the myth of sexuality the way in which we want to construct it, which means that not only does this affect same-gender loving people, but it also affects heterosexual people because of the way in which gender gets constructed and the way in which women are taught to be subservient to men. So I mean, I don't understand how we can keep saying, wives, be submissive to your husband, and then when the boyfriend or husband comes out of prison and keeps lying, saying nothing happened there, how do we empower women to require that these men use condoms? But what the church does keeps constructing gender such that men have to be in control of women's bodies. And women can't be in control of their own bodies. And so as long as we keep those views of sexuality going, which clearly the biblical text supports, then it's very difficult to break out of it unless we're prepared to say that at some points the Bible is wrong. And we have come to a realization that the Bible is wrong.
Wow.
But most of us are too afraid to say that, and instead we keep trying to reform it in ways that keep people going along with their oppression. So what happens with the clergy is the clergy, in order to be ordained, have to toe the line to keep the heteropatriarchy going. And as long as they're willing to do that, and it isn't just the men. As long,
Right.
I've asked at ITC, are we training women to prop up incompetent male clergy? Is that what we're doing? Are we training women to preach like men so that they can't use their own understanding of gender in the sermon? What are we doing here? But this is, as Dr. Cannon is saying, this grows out of an institution which is totally heteropatriarchal, which assumes that heterosexuality is normative and men ought to be in control. And women keep that thing going in the church. When Dr. Roberts got the first woman as an assistant minister at Ebenezer, one of the deacons came to me to get my support against her. I guess he figured I would be against her. And he said, well, I
I can't stand it. Every time she get up in the pulpit, I get sexually aroused. I said, well, you know, there have been women sitting out there fantasizing about the pastor, you know, so, you know, just keep the hymnal in your lap when it's, you know, your turn just on the front pew. But also don't try to carry it out. But again, part of what I'm trying to say is we have eroticized the pulpit.
Wow.
And those of us in the pulpit eroticize the pulpit. And we try to keep those sexual fantasies going. So that's also part of the abuse that we use in the way in which we preach, which is really trying to get an erotic response from people. Not a thinking response.
Not a thinking response.
Not that there isn't a thinking part of eroticism, but there's a way in which we try to build a schism.
How do you follow behind
Dr.
that? How do you follow behind that? I wanted to speak to the psychology of accepting the lies and living in the cloud of not being honest. And I think one of the things that happens with sexuality is we don't talk about it enough. There is this hush-hush over whether heterosexual pre-marriage sex or whether it's homosexual sex. And it helps the abuser to imprison his victim. Because if we're not talking about it in the open as a society, if we're not putting a name on sex and sexual relationships regardless of gender, then when somebody gets abused, again, that inner turn that we have psychologically into ourselves that says, what is wrong with me? What did I do? How can I make this better? Then we accept the lies because, again, the lies make sense. Because as a society, as a whole, we're not talking about sex. We're not talking about, you know, our own sexual arousal. We're not open about sexual relationships. We're not open about intimate, non-sexual relationships. And so there's also this thing that happens oftentimes when groomed by a sexual abuser to his victim or her victim, that it kind of goes and goes and we don't see it coming. The person being abused does not see it coming. They don't see the subtle signs that something is inappropriate, because we haven't even talked about intimate relationships. We haven't talked about appropriate relationships with our children and with each other. So then when they do get abused, it's confusing. And then there's no word for it. There's no language for it. There's no conversation about it. And then again, we push it right under the rug and we keep on going. Either we lie our way right through it, or we accept the lie that somebody else is given because it makes sense for the internal process that psychologically we had to come up with.
And I think when we are unable to talk about sexuality in our society and in our churches, what happens is sin becomes sexualized. And so when people start talking about the sins of the nation, invariably they are talking about sexual behavior, as if that's the only sin.
If that's a sin.
Exactly.
If sex in itself is a sin in the first place.
And I think part of it is, in our society, we also have this mythology that we are all have equal access to society. If you take a survey and ask people, what class do you belong to, 90% of the people will answer the middle class. And that just does not fit the statistics or the demographics. But what happens is we have this mythology that we are all equal, we all have equal access, and that we do not have a class system or power differentials in our society. And so we can't see it, we don't talk about it, and when it is very clear that something's wrong, we often come up with remedies or solutions that are totally inadequate because they do not address the root problem of these abuse of power and holding people in power to be accountable.